They're just bones. The dead have no need for them. But I do, said one of Utah's most famous legends in defense of his crime. The story of Jean-Baptiste has captivated historians and horrified locals since the time of Brigham Young, Mormon prophet, who, for lack of better words, went a little Old Testament, if you will, on the man, and perhaps in the most significant way helped solidify Baptiste as the urban legend he is today, the ghost of the Great Salt Lake. And to you, my beautiful ghosts, please like and subscribe and support me on Patreon to help ensure more stories like this get told. Without further ado, thank you. Let's get into it. Born in 1813 in Ireland, Jean-Baptiste was a wanderer who struggled to find any place that he could call home. When he appeared in Castlemaine, Australia, the natives said that he claimed to be from Venice, Italy, and it was noted of him that he didn't speak English very well, or any language very well, for that matter. Even stranger is that he was thought to be a Frenchman by those who knew him in Salt Lake City. He came over to the States from Melbourne on the 27th of April, 1855, aboard the LDS emigration vessel the Tarquinia. From Honolulu, he made his way toward San Francisco and stayed in California for a few years. We don't know exactly when he made his way to Salt Lake City, but by at least 1859, Baptiste was there, just over 10 years after the city had been founded by Mormon pioneers. He wooed Dorothy Jennison, and the two wed, and while serving faithfully as a ward choir director, he built him and his new wife a small cottage right next to the local cemetery, and naturally, he offered his services to the budding community as a gravedigger. Just a couple years later, in 1861, Abraham Lincoln appointed John W. Dawson to be governor of the Utah Territory. Unfortunately, upon arrival, he didn't make a very good impression with the community, though. In fact, it was reported that he made grossly improper proposals to Mormon widow Alabine Williams. We don't know what those proposals were, but it's recorded that in response, Alabine beat him with a fire shovel. Whatever happened angered the community enough to run Governor Dawson out of town. After only a few weeks in Salt Lake City, he took a mail coach retreating back to Ephraim Hank's Pony Express station at Mountain Dell, Utah, where Hank, the operator of the station, assured Dawson that he would be safe there. But what Hank didn't know is that Jason, Martin, and Wilford Luce, Wood Reynolds, Lot Huntington, Isaac Nabur, and Moroni Clausen, all young men, had followed Dawson to the station, where they found him, held him down, and castrated him. In the dramatic tussle, as you can imagine, city police arrived. They captured the young men, and in an attempt to escape, Moroni Clausen was shot and killed. The young men claimed to be acting under the direct orders of the Salt Lake City police chief, a claim that may or may not have been true. You gotta remember, things were different in the 1800s. As for Moroni, at the time, no one came forward to claim his body. Seeing the predicament, a certain officer, Henry Heath, out of respect for the man, purchased a suit for Moroni to be buried in, and he personally paid for his funeral expenses, and he was buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery by Jean-Baptiste. Moroni had died, Henry Heath had paid for his burial, and a nice suit for him to be buried in, and Jean-Baptiste dug the grave for Moroni himself. And that was nearly the end of this story. However, a few months later, Moroni's parents, who lived in Draper, Utah, had finally gotten word that their son was dead and buried in Salt Lake City. After grieving, they felt it necessary to bring Moroni to be laid to rest in a family plot in Draper nearer to them. So they paid to have his body exhumed and transported to Draper. Officer Heath oversaw the process, and upon digging him up, he was shocked to have found Moroni naked, absent the suit he had purchased for him, and what's more, he was flipped over, face down, in his casket. Moroni's brother, who was there to retrieve him, obviously, and rightly so, was furious. How could they have buried him in such a disrespectful manner? Officer Heath assured him that he was not buried this way, and desperate to understand what had happened, Officer Heath went to the house of Jean-Baptiste. He wasn't home, but Dorothy, his wife, was. Heath and a few other men who accompanied him started to question her, and couldn't help but notice some dirty crates stacked all around their home. Some of them had bits of clothing draped on the outside, pinched between other crates stacked on top of each other. As the questioning continued, Mrs. Baptiste seemed oblivious to any nefarious activity on the part of her husband, but it slowly became unavoidable, the truth that was about to be discovered. Heath's heart sank, for the crates were filled with clothing, dirty and stained clothing. In fact, they were filled with hundreds of items of clothing and other accessories from the dead. "Where is your husband now?" Officer Heath asked. Dorothy replied that he was in the cemetery, still seeming to be oblivious. Heath gritted his teeth and nearly sprinted out of the house to find Baptiste, all the while thinking about his daughter, Sarah, who had died and was buried in that very cemetery just 9 months earlier. It's likely Baptiste had dug her grave as well. As he made his way through the headstones, he spotted Baptiste digging a fresh grave. He approached and immediately accused him of robbing the dead. You'd think that Baptiste would deny it or try to make a run for it, but immediately tears welled up in his eyes. He dropped to his knees and admitted to it and began to plead for his life, understanding the grave nature of his sin that he could no longer hide from. Officer Heath bound his wrists together and at gunpoint walked up and down the cemetery asking him which graves he had robbed. Heath would point at one and ask, "This one?" And Baptiste would respond, "Yes." Heath pointed to another, and again Baptiste said yes, and another, and again yes, yes, yes. I robbed that one as well. At the time, it was impossible to make a full inventory, but Heath pointed to over a dozen, which Baptiste had responded in the affirmative, and then they approached his daughter Sarah's grave. Officer Heath gritted his teeth and, feeling overwhelmed with disgust and anger, pointed at her grave, staring at Baptiste with laser-focused eyes. Baptiste looked at the headstone and then at Officer Heath, who was pointing his gun at him with a scowl. Baptiste took a breath and said, "No." In an interview after the fact, Heath stated that he was prepared to have killed Baptiste then and there had he admitted to defiling his daughter's grave, but he said no, and he couldn't. Even if he was lying, he couldn't have been sure. They took Baptiste to the local prison, where they had armed guards there to protect him, as news of the events would not go over well with the community. There is no official record of how many graves he had robbed, but based on the amount of clothing they were able to recover from his house, which consisted mostly of women's burial clothing and entire crates of pairs of children's shoes, they estimated the number to extend into the hundreds, potentially 300 graves or more. Eventually, all of the clothing, shoes, watches, and other items recovered from his house were put on display at the courthouse for locals to come and claim if they could remember what had been taken from their loved ones in the grave. Anything that went unclaimed were all neatly placed, folded, and buried all together in a mass grave in the cemetery. Now that Baptiste, former choir director of his ward, was in custody, the question arose, what should be done with him? Strangely, there are no court records of his crime. There are few records at all of what happened to him after the fact. But a significant source of information about this incident comes to us from the Deseret News, who reported on a sermon Brigham Young, president and prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons, gave over the pulpit concerning the matter in 1862. He said of Baptiste, "I am unable to think so low as to get at such a mean, contemptible, damnable trick. To hang a man for such a deed would not begin to satisfy my feelings. What shall we do with him? Shoot him? Would you imprison him for life? That would do nobody any good. What I would do came to me quickly after I heard of the circumstance. If it were up to me, I would make him a fugitive and a vagabond upon the earth," comparing Baptiste to that cursed creature from the Old Testament, Cain, who pled with God, saying, "My punishment is more than I can bear. President Young went on to address those who were worried about the eternal state of their deceased. He went on to mention that he himself had 3 sisters, 2 wives, and several children in the cemetery, and noting that it would be quite the ordeal for everyone concerned about their loved ones to exhume each body from their grave and reclothe them if need be, he comforted their fears concerning the matter. "Some may inquire," he started, "whether it is necessary to put fresh linen into the coffins of those who have been robbed of their clothing. As to this, you can pursue the course that will give you the most contentment. But if the dead have been laid away as well as they can be, I will promise you now that they will be clothed in the resurrection, for the earth and the elements around them are full of these things. I do not trouble myself about my dead. If they are stripped of their clothing, I do not want to know it." He continued, "Some, I have been informed, can now remember having had singular dreams, and others have heard rappings on the door, on the bedstead, on the floor, and on the table, and have imagined that they might have proceeded from the spirits of the dead, calling on their friends and family to give them clothing, for they were naked." To this, President Young responded bluntly, "My dead friends have not been to me to tell me that they were naked, and if any such rappings should come to me, I should tell them to go to their own place. I have little faith in those rappings. If I felt that I ought to pay attention to such things, I would not let my right hand know what my left did, and it would require a greater power than Jean-Baptiste to make me believe either a truth or a lie." Ultimately, some were comforted, but others weren't, and Young placed no blame on those who wept and felt compelled to exhume the bodies of their loved ones, should they need to be clothed again, and many did, while others, like President Young himself, left the matter to God. Baptiste ultimately had his ears cropped and the words "grave robber" in bold letters tattooed on his forehead. He was then ferried out to Fremont Island in the Great Salt Lake to be exiled there. The only sign of civilization on the island was a small shack, occasionally stocked with supplies and food by a Miller family who used the space to graze their cattle. 2 Miller brothers visited the island every few weeks to check on their herd. Their first visit 3 weeks after Baptiste was exiled there. They had confirmed he was indeed still on the island. A couple months later, when they visited again, it would seem Baptiste was gone. Their shack had been dismantled, and they theorized that Baptiste had attempted to make a raft out of it. Whether he made it to shore to this day, however, remains unknown. A few decades later, in 1890, a human skull was found on the shore of the Great Salt Lake. A few years after that, a whole skeleton, missing its head, was also found, with a ball and chain around his ankle. From here, we get the legend that the ghost of Jean-Baptiste, the Mormon grave robber, haunts the shores of the Great Salt Lake, forever condemned to roam the earth as a fugitive and a vagabond. Later in his life, Officer Henry Heath, hearing that human remains were found, claimed that Baptiste didn't have a ball and chain around his feet, and that he thought he might have actually escaped and made it to a mining camp up in Montana. I wonder, though, if Baptiste did in fact have a chain around his ankles, it would make sense. And I wonder if Heath knew it. I wonder if, even after hearing President Young's words of comfort, I wonder if he fell in amongst a crowd who were comfortless, and perhaps was even haunted by the thought his daughter's grave, potentially, was defiled by Baptiste. I wonder what would have happened if Baptiste lied about Sarah's grave to save his life, only for Heath to find out later the truth. I don't know what happened to Jean-Baptiste, and as far as I know, no one else does either. But some claim to have seen his ghost roaming the shores of the lake. Others have reported balls of light hovering in erratic patterns near Fremont Island. But tell me, have you seen him? Or have you seen any other ghost for that matter? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and please support me on Patreon and get your name in the credits right here. And also so I can continue making these videos. From the bottom of my heart, thank you.